Clayton Clay Barrow never wanted to be involved in neighborhood disputes. He had spent most of his life in high-risk environments, testing aircraft that pushed the limits of engineering, trusting his life to machines that had no margin for error. His body still carried the consequences of that work: strained ligaments, a spine that cracked with every stretch, and a lingering sensitivity to light from a high-G incident that nearly cost him his sight. After his forced retirement from aviation testing, he had no interest in battles over property lines, zoning ordinances, or the petty squabbles of small-town politics. All he wanted was peace. That was why he had chosen this place, 40 acres of rugged, untamed land on the outskirts of a quiet Oregon town, where the air smelled like pine and wet earth, and the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. It was exactly what he had envisioned when he left his old life behind. His farm wasn't large, nor was it particularly lucrative. It was just enough to sustain itself, a simple operation with a few cattle, vegetable patches, and an orchard that gave him more apples than he could ever eat. He sold produce, eggs, and honey at a small roadside stand, and the locals who appreciated fresh food without supermarket markups had come to rely on it. He wasn't in it for the money. He had enough saved from his years in the test flight industry to live comfortably. What mattered to him was self-sufficiency. He had spent years putting his life in the hands of engineers, mechanics, and mission control operators who dictated when it was safe to move and when it wasn't. Now, for the first time in his life, no one was telling him what to do. No flight schedules, no pre-mission checklists. Just the land, his hands, and the knowledge that whatever he built was his. At least that's what he thought. The first sign of trouble had been subtle. A letter, neatly typed on thick paper, left inside his mailbox without postage, which meant someone had come onto his property to place it there. The letterhead read Community Development Initiative, a term vague enough to mean anything. Inside, the message was polite, almost rehearsed an invitation, no, an expectation for him to attend a meeting about the integration of properties into the neighborhood beautification program. He had ignored it. It had nothing to do with him. His land wasn't part of any association, and he had made sure of that when he bought it. He had checked and double-checked, even hired a lawyer to confirm that his property was legally independent of any community governance. Then came the second letter. This one wasn't an invitation. It was a notice. It stated that new guidelines had been introduced for properties in the area, that there were expectations for compliance, and that his current setup, his fencing, his signage, his presentation was inconsistent with community standards. The language was soft, but the message was clear: conform or expect consequences. He tossed it into the trash. Then came the visitors. A group of 3, dressed in coordinated business casual, had arrived unannounced one afternoon, standing at his gate as if waiting for an invitation that would never come. One of them, a woman in her late 50s with the kind of stiff posture that suggested a lifetime of managing other people's business, introduced herself as Karen Dutcher, chairwoman of the local community council. She smiled too wide, her words measured and overly polite as she explained the benefits of community engagement, the importance of cohesive aesthetics, and the shared responsibility of all residents to maintain the value of their surroundings. Clay had listened without expression, arms crossed, letting her say what she needed to say. When she was finished, he had responded in a flat, even tone. "I don't belong to your neighborhood." Karen's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted, a brief flicker of irritation before the mask slipped back into place. "Oh, but you do, Mr. Barrow. These new community guidelines extend to all properties within the designated growth sector." "I don't remember signing anything agreeing to that." "Oh, there's no need for signatures. The committee recently revised our jurisdictional boundaries to ensure consistency in the area. It's all quite standard." It was the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak Clay had heard his entire life: polite, rehearsed, but fundamentally meaningless. He had dealt with corporate executives who tried to tell him that safety margins could be ignored if the numbers looked good. This was the same kind of manipulation, but applied to land instead of aviation. He had simply told them no and shut the gate in their faces. 2 days later, his farm sign disappeared. The wooden sign he had built himself, hand-painted with bold lettering reading Barrow's Haven Fresh Farm Goods, had stood at the entrance of his driveway for 3 years without incident. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. It was how customers found him, how locals recognized his farm. But now it was gone. Not broken, not fallen. Removed. The post had been cleanly sawed off at the base, as if someone had taken the time to ensure it looked deliberate. In its place was a laminated notice, staked into the ground with a plastic marker. Unauthorized signage has been removed in accordance with community regulations. Please contact the council for inquiries. No name. No contact number. Just a stamp at the bottom reading Community Oversight Committee. Clay stood there for a long time, staring at the sign, jaw tightening. He wasn't an impulsive man. He had spent decades training to keep his emotions in check under extreme conditions, learning to make decisions based on logic, not feelings. But there was something about the quiet arrogance of this action, someone coming onto his land, deciding for him what was acceptable, that made his pulse slow and cold. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was a message. And Clay Barrow wasn't the kind of man to ignore a warning. He had options. He could drive into town, march into the community office, and demand answers. But he had spent his life dealing with bureaucrats, and he knew their tactics. They would deflect, stall, bury him in paperwork, until he either conformed or exhausted himself fighting a system designed to wear people down. So instead, he did something else. He went into town, bought a new post, and built a bigger sign. Twice as large, reinforced with steel brackets and cemented 3 feet into the ground. If someone wanted to take this one down, they'd need more than a saw. They'd need heavy equipment. 2 days later, the sign was gone again. This time, there was no laminated notice, no explanation. Just fresh tire tracks in the dirt and the unmistakable indentations of boot prints near the disturbed cement. Whoever had done it had worked fast. Efficiently. That was when he realized this wasn't just about a sign. And if they thought he was going to roll over, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Clay Barrow had seen many things in his life. He had been in freefall from 30,000 feet when an experimental stabilization system had failed, had watched a cockpit windshield fracture under extreme pressure, had felt his ribs crack under the weight of a sudden ejection. He had spent years training his mind to remain calm in situations where most men would panic, where fear would take control and turn rational thinking into blind reaction. He had learned to measure his responses, to process information before acting, to make decisions that were calculated rather than emotional. But as he stood there, staring at the place where his second farm sign had been removed, where the cemented base had been dug out with what looked like construction equipment, where deep, deliberate tire tracks led away from the scene like an unspoken warning, he felt something that he had not felt in a long time, a cold, steady anger that settled deep in his bones, rather than flashing hot through his veins. Whoever had done this was organized. They weren't acting on impulse, weren't just some local troublemakers looking to stir up nonsense for fun. This was deliberate, methodical, and efficient, and it told him something crucial. Whoever was behind it had resources, authority, and the confidence that he wouldn't be able to stop them. That last part was a mistake. He wasn't about to storm into an office and start demanding answers from people who would only give him bureaucratic runaround, but he wasn't going to sit back and wait for whatever came next either. He needed to know who was behind it, what their endgame was, and whether this was just about a sign or something much bigger. He didn't trust local officials to give him a straight answer, but he knew someone who might. There was a man named Earl Givens who worked at the county records office. A guy Clay had met a few times when he had first bought the land and needed to make sure his property boundaries were ironclad. Earl was the type of man who knew everything about every parcel of land in the area, who had spent the better part of 3 decades watching as property lines shifted, as names changed on deeds, as land was quietly swallowed up by larger developments. He wasn't the kind of man who would stick his neck out, but if you asked him the right questions in the right way, he would tell you what you needed to know. So Clay drove into town, parked his truck 2 blocks away from the county building just in case someone had the bright idea of keeping track of his movements, and walked in like he had all the time in the world. The building was old, the kind of municipal structure built in the 70s with no regard for aesthetics, just rows of beige hallways lined with filing cabinets and offices where overworked clerks sat behind metal desks piled with paperwork. Earl's office was in the back, tucked behind a door that had seen better days, with a nameplate that was slightly crooked, as if someone had tried to rip it off once and never bothered to fix it. Clay knocked once, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. Earl was sitting behind his desk, hunched over a stack of papers with a cup of coffee that looked like it had been reheated too many times. He looked up, his expression shifting from tired boredom to mild surprise when he saw who had walked in. "Well, damn. I was wondering when you'd show up," Earl said, setting his pen down and leaning back in his chair. "Figured it was only a matter of time." Clay raised an eyebrow. "You already know why I'm here." Earl let out a slow breath through his nose, rubbing a hand over his balding scalp. "Let's just say I had a feeling. Word gets around fast in this town, and when people start making moves on land that was supposed to be off limits, I start paying attention." Clay pulled up a chair without being invited, resting his forearms on his knees as he studied the man across from him. "So what exactly are they trying to pull?" Earl hesitated, glancing toward the open door before standing up and shutting it. He sat back down, folding his hands on the desk. "There's been some quiet shuffling going on with the county zoning maps," he said, lowering his voice. "Some properties have been, let's say, reclassified. Some of it's legal, some of it's in a gray area, and some of it he let the sentence trail off, shaking his head. Some of it stinks to high heaven." Clay felt his jaw tighten. "And my land," Earl exhaled through his nose. "Your land is supposed to be part of a community expansion initiative officially. They're saying it's about beautification and modernization, but I've seen this play before. They push small independent owners into compliance, use fines and zoning violations to wear them down. And when they finally sell, because let's face it, most people don't have the time or resources to fight this kind of battle, the land gets repurposed for development." Clay's stomach hardened. "Who's behind it?" Earl hesitated again, then pulled a file from a drawer, flipping it open to reveal a list of names. He tapped one in particular. "Karen Dutcher." "She's the face of it," Earl said. "But she's not the one pulling the strings. There's money involved here, real money, from people who don't put their names on paper. They want your land because it's in the way of something bigger." Clay studied the paper, then looked up. "What happens if I don't sell?" Earl met his gaze, and for the first time there was something like real concern in his eyes. "Then they'll keep pushing, and if pushing doesn't work, they'll start shoving." Clay sat there for a moment, letting the information settle, then stood up. "Appreciate it, Earl." Earl nodded but didn't look happy. "Just watch yourself, Clay. This isn't just some HOA bullshit. These people play for keeps." Clay walked out of the office, his mind already turning over the next move. He wasn't dealing with a petty neighborhood council trying to enforce minor rules. This was a coordinated effort to pressure him into giving up his land, and if they were serious enough to start playing with zoning laws and land reclassification, then they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Which meant one thing: if they wanted a fight, they were going to get one, and they were about to find out just how stubborn a man like him could be. Clay Barrow had always believed that when people wanted something badly enough, they showed their true nature. It wasn't always immediate, but if you pushed the right buttons, applied the right kind of pressure, you could see what someone was really made of. He had seen it in pilots when they were forced to eject from a failing aircraft, in engineers when they were caught covering up a system flaw, in corporate executives when their financial shortcuts started killing people. It was in those moments when they realized they had lost control that their masks slipped, and you could finally see them for who they were. The people coming after his land hadn't shown their true faces yet, but Clay knew it was only a matter of time. 2 days after his visit to Earl Givens, the first real escalation came. It was early morning when he noticed the survey markers. Thin wooden stakes with bright orange ribbons lined the far edge of his property, driven into the ground with the precision of professionals. He hadn't ordered a land survey. He hadn't authorized anyone to step foot on his land. And yet, here they were cleanly placed, running along the edge of his fence, extending far beyond where any normal zoning adjustments should have been. Clay walked the length of the markers, following them toward the southern edge of his land where the tree line thickened. The more he walked, the more he realized something was off. These markers weren't just outlining a section of land, they were encircling it. Someone was marking territory as if preparing for development. The lines extended beyond his property, bleeding into the adjacent lots, connecting in a way that suggested a larger, organized plan. He wasn't an idiot. He knew what this meant. Someone had already decided that his land wasn't really his anymore, that it was just a matter of time before he was pushed out, whether through legal pressure or something less civil. But Clay had never been the kind of man to back down just because someone with a clipboard thought they could outmaneuver him. Instead of ripping out the stakes in frustration, he took a different approach. He pulled out his phone, snapped pictures of the markers, made note of the coordinates, and then did something he knew would throw them off. He left the markers exactly where they were. He wanted whoever had placed them to think he hadn't noticed, that he was oblivious to what they were doing, because if they thought they had the advantage, they'd get sloppy. And they did. That afternoon, a white pickup truck rolled up to his driveway. It was the kind of vehicle local contractors used, unmarked, no company logo, nothing to indicate who it belonged to. The man who stepped out was in his late 40s, wearing a pressed button-down shirt tucked into jeans that were too clean for someone who actually worked in construction. He walked with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before, approaching landowners, shaking hands, delivering bad news in a voice so friendly it almost felt like reassurance. "Mr. Barrow." Clay didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough to see if the man would flinch. He didn't. "Who's asking?" The man smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Russ Tanner. I work with an independent land development firm. We've been conducting routine assessments of properties in the area, and I just wanted to check in with you about some changes that might be coming down the line." Clay leaned against his truck, crossing his arms. "Routine assessments, huh? That why someone's been marking my land without permission?" Russ didn't miss a beat. "Oh, those are just preliminary boundary markers. Nothing's final yet. We're just gathering data." Clay let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. "Right. And what exactly are you gathering data for?" Russ hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Well, as you may have heard, there's been some discussion about modernizing the area. Nothing set in stone yet, but the county has been reviewing potential projects that would improve infrastructure, encourage investment. That sort of thing." Clay tilted his head slightly. "Cut the bullshit. What's really going on?" Russ sighed, as if disappointed that they couldn't keep up the polite charade. "All right, look, I'll be straight with you. There's an opportunity here, Mr. Barrow. A real opportunity. Your land sits in a prime spot for what could be a significant development project. We're talking about real money, long-term investments. Something that could benefit the entire community. And frankly, it would be a lot easier if you were willing to work with us instead of against us." Clay studied him for a long moment. "And if I say no," Russ spread his hands, "then that's your right. But I'd hate to see you deal with all the headaches that come from fighting something that's already in motion." There it was. The threat hidden beneath the thin veneer of professionalism. It was the same playbook these types always used. At first, it was all about how they were working together, about how everyone benefits. But the second you refused to play along, they made it clear that this wasn't actually a choice. Clay pushed off his truck, stepping forward just enough that Russ had to shift his weight. "Get off my land." Russ sighed again, deeper this time, as if Clay had just made things harder than they needed to be. "All right, I'll pass that along. But just so you know, this isn't personal, it's just business." Clay watched as Russ got back in his truck, turned around, and drove off. He didn't react, didn't let himself get visibly angry, because he knew that was exactly what they wanted. They wanted him to be impulsive, to lash out, to make a mistake they could use against him later. Instead, he went inside, locked the door, and pulled out the file Earl had given him 2 days before. He read through every name on the list, every connection between the council, the developers, and the companies that had been quietly buying up land in the area. And then, just to be sure, he made some phone calls of his own. Because the next time they came for him, he wouldn't just be waiting, he'd be ready. Clay Barrow had spent the past week anticipating the next move, knowing that whoever was pushing this land grab wouldn't take his rejection as the final word. He had been in enough high-stakes situations to understand how people operated when they thought they had all the power. They didn't just walk away. They circled back, applied pressure in different ways, found new angles of attack until they got what they wanted. That was how corporations operated, how developers worked, how bureaucrats in polished offices buried people in red tape until they drowned in it. And Clay knew that was exactly what was coming. The first sign that things had escalated beyond just talk came early one morning when he walked outside to check on the cattle and found that someone had left his gate wide open. It wasn't the wind. The metal latch had been cut clean through, and fresh tire tracks ran across the dirt road leading away from his property. 3 of his cows had already wandered beyond the fence line, slowly making their way toward the tree line, but it could have been worse. If he hadn't come outside when he did, the entire herd might have been lost. That would have been tens of thousands of dollars gone in a matter of hours. The kind of setback that would have made running the farm impossible. He spent the next 2 hours securing the cattle, repairing the gate, and checking the perimeter for anything else that might have been tampered with. He found more footprints near the back of his property, deep impressions in the damp earth, suggesting that at least 2 people had been walking around during the night. They hadn't just opened the gate, they had been scouting. It was a message. They weren't just leaning on legal tactics anymore. They were showing him exactly how vulnerable his property was, how easily they could cause real damage if he didn't play along. If they could do this once, they could do it again. Next time, it wouldn't just be the cattle. Next time, it could be his well, his house, his equipment. He wasn't about to wait for that to happen. He took the photos of the cut latch, the tire tracks, the footprints, and went straight into town. But instead of going to the community office where Karen Dutcher and her people would just give him more runaround, he went to Sheriff Doug Halverson, a man he had known for years. Doug wasn't the kind of lawman who liked getting involved in land disputes, but he also wasn't the type to ignore evidence of trespassing and property damage. Doug was sitting behind his desk when Clay walked into the station, flipping through paperwork with the kind of tired resignation that came from dealing with too many small-town problems that never seemed to go away. When he saw the expression on Clay's face, though, he set the papers down and leaned forward. "You look like you've got something serious," Doug said. Clay placed his phone on the desk and pulled up the photos. "Someone broke onto my land last night, cut my gate open, let my cattle loose, left tire tracks and footprints all over the place." Doug frowned as he scrolled through the pictures. "You catch anyone on your cameras." No, Clay admitted, irritation tightening his jaw. They were smart, stayed out of range, but they left their calling card. Doug exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "You think this has to do with that mess with the council?" "I don't think." "I know." Doug sat back in his chair, staring at the images for a long moment before shaking his head. "Look, Clay, I don't doubt you, but this town runs on unwritten rules, and you know how these things go. Even if I file an official complaint, you really think I'm going to find a judge around here willing to let me pull in Karen Dutcher and her friends for questioning?" Clay's lips pressed into a thin line. "So what? I just let them do whatever the hell they want." Doug sighed. "I'll file the report. I'll talk to a couple of people, see if I can shake something loose. But if you're looking for immediate action, you're going to have to do more than just show me some pictures." Clay expected that answer, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. He wasn't naive enough to think that local law enforcement would take on people with money and political connections without ironclad proof. The sheriff might have been willing to listen, but that didn't mean he was ready to start making arrests. As he walked out of the station, he checked his phone and saw a new email notification. It was from a name he didn't recognize, and when he opened it, the body of the message was only 1 sentence long. "They aren't just after your land. Meet me at the old gas station outside town at 7 p.m. No signature, no details. Just that." Clay read the message 3 times before locking his phone and tucking it into his pocket. He had been expecting a move from the council, another escalation meant to pressure him into compliance, but this was something different. Someone on the inside, whoever they were, was trying to reach out. At exactly 7 p.m., he pulled into the lot of the abandoned gas station 5 miles outside of town. The building had been shut down for years, its windows boarded up, the paint on the metal awning faded and peeling. A single truck was already parked there, an old Ford with a dent in the driver's side door. Clay stepped out of his own truck and approached. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in his 60s with deep lines in his face and eyes that had seen too much. "You don't know me," the man said. "Name's Vic. I used to work zoning for the county, retired last year, didn't like the way things were changing." Clay crossed his arms. "You sent the email." Vic nodded. "Figured someone needed to tell you what's really going on before it's too late." "Go ahead," Clay said. Vic exhaled. "This ain't just about pushing you out for some new housing development. They've been planning this for years. Dutcher's part of it, sure, but she's not the one calling the shots. The real players? They're outside this town. Big money people looking to turn this whole stretch of land into a controlled development zone. The kind where the original owners don't get a say. That's why they're targeting you. You're in the way." Clay stared at him, letting the weight of that settle. He had known it wasn't just about neighborhood expansion, but hearing it confirmed was different. "And what happens if I don't move?" Vic's expression darkened. "They're going to keep coming, and if pressure doesn't work, they'll use other means." Clay's jaw clenched. "Let them try." Vic shook his head. "You don't get it. These people don't just make problems disappear. They make people disappear." Clay didn't flinch. "Then they're going to find out the hard way that I don't scare easy." Vic hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it over. "These are names. People who signed off on the zoning changes. Some of them, they don't even know what they agreed to. But the ones at the top, they do. If you want to fight this, start there." Clay took the paper and tucked it into his pocket without looking at it. He already knew he wasn't backing down. He just didn't realize yet how far they were willing to go to break him. Clay Barrow had dealt with pressure his entire life. Whether it was pushing an aircraft beyond its intended limits, handling emergency landings, or surviving corporate meetings where people in suits tried to tell him what risks were acceptable. He had always understood that when someone with power wanted something, they wouldn't ask twice. They would apply pressure until the person in their way either broke or walked away. The difference was, Clay wasn't the type to break, and he sure as hell wasn't walking away. What happened over the next few days only confirmed what he had suspected all along. This wasn't about following regulations or maintaining some fabricated sense of order in the community. This was about force, about making his life difficult enough that he would eventually decide it wasn't worth the fight. The first real indication that they were escalating their tactics came when his well pump was destroyed. He had woken up early, as he always did, and gone out to check on the cattle, only to find them restless and agitated. When he turned on the water supply, nothing came out. His first thought was that it was a minor issue, maybe a small blockage or an electrical glitch in the system, but when he walked over to the well, it took him exactly 2 seconds to realize that wasn't the case. The pump had been ripped apart. Not just tampered with. Not just broken. It had been deliberately, methodically dismantled. The casing had been cracked open, the wiring yanked out and stripped, the motor completely ruined. Someone had taken the time to ensure that it wouldn't be fixable with a quick repair job. They had wanted this to hurt. He had spent the next hour assessing the damage, cursing under his breath as he realized he wouldn't be able to fix it himself. He had dealt with mechanical failures before, had even repaired a few industrial pumps in his time, but this was beyond a simple fix. The entire system would have to be replaced. He had made the calls, scheduled the repairs, but the soonest anyone could come was 3 days out, and that meant 3 days without a direct water supply. He could truck in water, sure, but that wasn't the point. The point was that someone had gotten onto his land, walked right up to his well, and sabotaged it. Not an accident. Not a coincidence. A warning. And then, before he even had a chance to fully deal with that, the power went out. It was just after sunset when the lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went black. At first, he assumed it was a typical outage, something had gone wrong down the line, maybe a storm had knocked something loose. But when he stepped outside with a flashlight and followed the power lines back toward the main road, his gut told him otherwise. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, but when his beam landed on the destroyed transformer box, he exhaled slowly, gripping the light a little tighter as he took in the damage. The metal casing had been pried open, the fuses ripped out, the wiring completely gutted. The work was precise, clean, deliberate. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't vandalism. It wasn't a couple of local punks causing trouble. It was calculated sabotage. Clay clenched his jaw, taking a moment to breathe, to center himself, to push down the immediate urge to act on anger. Reacting emotionally was exactly what they wanted. They wanted him flustered, panicked, desperate. He wouldn't give them that. Instead, he did what he always did. He took control of the situation. He spent the next hour setting up his backup generator, restoring enough power to keep the house running, then made the necessary calls to have the damage repaired, knowing damn well that whoever had done this was counting on him not having the resources to fix things quickly. But he did. They had underestimated him, and that was their first mistake. The next morning, he drove into town and went straight to Doug Halverson, the sheriff who had already given him the runaround once, but who was also the only law enforcement officer in town who wasn't completely in someone's pocket. Clay had known Doug for years, knew he wasn't a bad guy, just the kind of man who avoided confrontation unless he absolutely had to step in. But now it was time for him to step in. He walked into the station, found Doug sitting behind his desk, and dropped his phone onto the table, scrolling through the photos of the well, the power box, the damage. Doug didn't say anything at first. He just sighed, rubbed his temple, then leaned back in his chair. "Jesus, Clay," he muttered. "You think this is them?" Clay gave him a hard look. "We both know it is." Doug hesitated, tapping his fingers on the desk. "Look, I get it. This is serious. But I need more than just pictures of a busted power box and a broken well. You got cameras? Footage of anyone actually doing it?" Clay exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. "No. They stayed out of range." Doug sighed again. "Then I can file a report, but you know how this works. Without direct evidence, without a witness, there's not much I can do." Clay clenched his jaw. "So what? I just wait until they pull something worse." Doug didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, he leaned forward. "I'll poke around, see what I can find. But you need to be smart about this, Clay. These people? They don't play fair." Clay already knew that. He had known it the second they started moving against him. He didn't say anything else, just nodded once, turned, and walked out. That night he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, shotgun across his lap, watching the land, waiting. And at 2 a.m. they came again. He saw the movement first, 2 figures, staying low, moving toward the fence at the back of his property. He didn't react immediately, didn't let them know he had seen them. Instead, he moved quietly, staying in the shadows, watching. One of them was holding a tool looked like a crowbar. The other had what appeared to be a small device, something metallic, something he couldn't quite make out in the dark. They were tampering with something. Clay exhaled slowly, then stepped forward. "Put it down." The 2 men froze. One of them turned slightly, just enough that Clay could see his face in the moonlight. Russ Tanner, the same smug consultant who had tried to get him to sell his land, standing there in the middle of the night with a damn crowbar like a common criminal. Clay tightened his grip on the shotgun. "Step away from the fence. Hands where I can see them." Russ didn't move at first. Then he smirked, slow and deliberate. "You really think you're going to shoot me?" Barrow, his voice was calm. Too calm. "You know how that would look? Some crazy landowner gunning down a harmless contractor in the middle of the night." Clay didn't lower the gun. "I don't need to shoot you. I just need you to get the hell off my land." Russ tilted his head slightly, then took a step back. "All right, no need to get worked up," he turned to his partner, gesturing. "Let's go." They backed away, disappearing into the tree line, and Clay didn't lower the gun until he couldn't hear them anymore. But as he stood there, staring at the spot where they had been, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Clay Barrow had spent the past few weeks watching the noose tighten around his neck, feeling the slow, methodical pressure of people who wanted him gone, but didn't have the guts to say it outright. They had tried bureaucracy first, throwing zoning laws and property regulations at him like weapons, hoping he would get tired of fighting and sell. When that hadn't worked, they had escalated to sabotage, cutting his power, destroying his well, trying to wear him down piece by piece. But Clay wasn't built to fold. He had spent his entire life making decisions under pressure, learning to think 5 steps ahead when disaster struck, adapting to situations where failure meant death. The difference was, in his old life, the threats had been mechanical malfunctions, bad weather, or miscalculations at 30,000 feet. Here, the threat was human, and humans were predictable. They always pushed too far. It happened just before midnight. Clay had been sleeping lightly, his body exhausted from long days of repairing the damage they had already caused, but his mind still wired with the anticipation that they weren't finished. When he heard the noise of faint metallic clank, barely audible through the night, his eyes opened instantly. He didn't move at first, didn't give away that he was awake. He just listened, letting the darkness settle around him, waiting for the next sound. There. A soft scrape, like metal against wood, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps near the porch. He exhaled slowly, forcing his breathing to stay even, then moved silently out of bed, grabbing the shotgun he had kept within reach every night since this had started. The floorboards didn't creak as he made his way toward the front door. Years of experience had trained him to move without sound, without hesitation. He reached the window, staying just out of sight, and glanced outside. 3 figures. One near the porch, crouched low, doing something near the base of the steps. Another by the side of the house, partially hidden in the shadows. The third standing near the fence, keeping watch. They weren't kids pulling a prank. They weren't random trespassers. They were working. Clay took a slow breath, gripping the shotgun tighter. He had been waiting for this. The gradual escalation, the testing of boundaries, the way they kept pushing, seeing how much he would tolerate before he finally snapped. They wanted him to react, to make a mistake, to give them an excuse to brand him as the aggressor. He wasn't going to give them that. But he also wasn't about to sit back and let them do whatever the hell they wanted. He moved quickly, throwing the door open with enough force that it slammed against the wall, the sudden noise cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The man crouched near the steps jerked up in surprise, his hand yanking away from a bundle of wires that led directly to the support beams under the house. Clay didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, shotgun raised, voice like stone. Stand up. Hands where I can see them. The man froze. He was wearing a black jacket, gloves, a cap pulled low over his face. Professional, not some idiot off the street. His partner near the side of the house had already started moving, trying to disappear into the dark, but Clay wasn't having it. You run, I shoot. That's your only warning. The figure by the fence hesitated for a second, then bolted. Clay didn't bother with him. He kept his focus on the 2 still within range. The one by the house made the mistake of reaching for something inside his jacket. Clay fired. The shot wasn't meant to kill. He had aimed low, the blast hitting the dirt just inches from the man's feet, kicking up dust and sending a clear message. The man flinched, stumbled back, hands raised now, as if realizing too late that Clay wasn't bluffing. The one near the steps finally spoke, voice tight with barely concealed anger. Jesus, man, you trying to kill someone? Clay's voice was ice. You break into my land in the middle of the night, start wiring my damn house to something, and you expect me to just sit back and ask questions. Who sent you? Silence. Mom. The man by the house was watching Clay now, assessing, calculating. Not scared. Not like someone caught doing something stupid, like someone who had done this before and was trying to figure out how to spin it. You already know who sent us, the man near the porch finally said. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is what happens next. Clay didn't lower the gun. What happens next is up to you. A long pause. Then the man smiled. Not a friendly smile. A knowing one. You can't win this, Barrow, he said. You think this is the worst we can do? This isn't even close. Clay held his ground, but something inside him turned colder. This wasn't an idle threat. This was a warning, a promise. And then, before he could respond, headlights appeared in the distance. The two men didn't wait. They moved fast, disappearing into the darkness just as the vehicle came into view. Clay didn't try to stop them. His attention was now on the approaching truck, its engine growling as it rolled onto his property like it belonged there. He didn't recognize the vehicle, but the second it came to a stop and Karen Dutcher stepped out of the passenger side, he felt his stomach tighten. She didn't look surprised to see him standing there with a shotgun. She didn't even look particularly concerned. If anything, she seemed amused, like she had expected this moment. "Well," she said, folding her arms, "that's one way to welcome guests." Clay didn't lower the gun. "You send them." She tilted her head slightly. "Send who?" He didn't answer. They both knew the game. She sighed, looking around. "This has gone on long enough, don't you think? You've made your point. You're stubborn. But here's the thing, Mr. Barrow. Stubborn doesn't win against inevitability. We're giving you one last chance to walk away with something instead of nothing. Sell now, and you'll be able to leave on your own terms. Keep resisting," and she gestured toward the empty space where the two men had been standing moments ago. "Well, accidents happen." Clay held her gaze. "You think I scare easy?" She smiled. "I think you understand reality, and reality is you don't have the resources to fight this forever." Clay exhaled slowly, then took a step forward, just enough to erase the false sense of comfort she had, just enough to remind her that whatever power she thought she had, it wasn't standing here with her now. "I don't care how many men you send," he said quietly. "I don't care how much money you throw around. I don't care what bullshit legal tricks you pull. You come for me again, and I promise you next time, I won't be aiming at the dirt." For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Doubt. A sliver of it. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then smiled again. Smaller, tighter. Forced. "We'll see," she said. Then she got back in the truck, and as the vehicle drove off, Clay knew one thing for certain. They had just made their biggest mistake. Clay Barrow had spent the past few weeks being tested, pushed, worn down by the relentless pressure of people who believed they could outmaneuver him, outlast him, make his life just difficult enough that he would eventually cave. They had played their game well, attacking him through paperwork, through sabotage, through veiled threats and midnight intrusions, always careful, always just inside the lines of plausible deniability. But they had made one mistake, and it was the kind of mistake that only people who had spent their lives sitting behind desks could make. They had assumed that their control over the system meant they had control over him. They had believed that because they were backed by money, influence, and the slow, crushing weight of bureaucracy, he would eventually run out of options. What they had failed to understand was that Clay wasn't the kind of man who played by their rules. The morning after Karen Dutcher's late-night visit, he began making calls. He didn't go to the authorities. That route had already been exhausted, and he had no interest in filing another useless report that would end up buried under a pile of paperwork. Instead, he reached out to people who had real leverage: land surveyors, environmental consultants, legal specialists in rural zoning regulations. If they wanted to use the system against him, then he would turn the system into a weapon against them. By midday, he had confirmed what he had suspected all along. The community development expansion that had been used as justification for pushing him off his land had one very big, very fatal flaw. The land they were trying to take from him wasn't just valuable, it was protected. Years ago, before he had even purchased the property, a portion of the land had been flagged under an old environmental protection order due to the presence of a rare, federally recognized plant species that only grew in a handful of locations in the state. The order had never been enforced because the land had remained in private hands, and no large-scale development had ever been attempted. But now, with the rezoning and the push to seize control of his property, they had inadvertently triggered federal oversight. The moment Clay's legal team submitted the paperwork to reinstate the protection status, everything came to a screeching halt. The development contracts that had been quietly moving forward behind closed doors were suddenly frozen. The land acquisitions that had been steamrolling through local committees were now under federal review. Every permit, every authorization, every backroom deal they had set up was now tangled in red tape so thick that not even their money could cut through it. And the best part? There was nothing they could do about it. The next time Karen Dutcher came to see him, it wasn't in the middle of the night with hired men lurking in the shadows. It was in broad daylight, alone, her polished confidence noticeably thinner than before. She didn't even bother with fake pleasantries this time. She just stood at the edge of his porch, arms crossed, lips pressed into a tight line. "You think this changes anything?" she said finally. Clay looked at her, calm, unbothered, the weight of victory settling over him in a way that was more satisfying than he had expected. "It changes everything," he said. "Your development deal is dead. You overplayed your hand and now you've got federal oversight crawling all over your project. You're finished." For the first time, he saw something real break through her mask. Fear. Not fear of him, but fear of consequences. Fear of having gone too far, of having lost control of something she had been so sure was hers to manipulate. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "You really think this ends with a bunch of legal paperwork? You think the people backing this are just going to walk away?" "I don't care what they do," Clay said simply. "You came after me, you played dirty, and you lost. If you or anyone else so much as sets foot on my land again, I won't be filing reports. I won't be taking pictures. I won't be calling the sheriff. I will handle it myself. And I promise you, Karen, you don't want to know what that looks like." There was silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched between them like a final, unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. Then, finally, she gave a small, humorless laugh and stepped back. "Enjoy your little victory, Barrow," she said. "You think you won, but you're just a speed bump. People like you always are." She turned and walked away, and this time Clay didn't watch her go. He didn't need to. He had already won. Over the next few weeks, the fallout spread. The development project officially collapsed under the weight of legal disputes. Financial backers began pulling out, and those who had been pushing for expansion quietly distanced themselves, trying to avoid getting caught up in the wreckage. Karen Dutcher resigned from her position without ceremony. Her departure explained away with vague statements about new opportunities. No one in town believed it. Everyone knew she had been forced out. The men who had trespassed on Clay's property, the ones who had sabotaged his well, his power, his fences, were never officially connected to her, but they disappeared all the same. Some left town. Some simply stopped showing up in places they had once frequented. Clay didn't care where they went. He had his land, and that was all that mattered. It wasn't until weeks later, when everything had settled and he had started to return to the routine of his life, that he received the final reminder that this fight had never really been about Karen Dutcher or the council or some overambitious development project. It was something bigger, something more entrenched. He found the envelope in his mailbox one morning, no return address, no markings. Inside there was no letter, no threats, nothing overt, just a single sheet of paper with a printed message. "You're not the only one who knows how to wait." Clay stared at the words for a long time, his grip tightening slightly, but he felt no fear, no doubt, just understanding. They weren't coming back now, maybe not even soon. But someday when the right opportunity arose, when they thought he had let his guard down, they would try again. And when they did, he would be ready, just like he had always been.